Hello, and welcome to Competencies in Civil Discourse. My name is Erec Smith. I'm a research fellow here at Cato Institute. I am also the president and co-founder of Free Black Thought. What else am I? I'm a Pisces. What else? Philadelphia sports fan. ENFJ in the Myers-Briggs. But also a former associate professor of rhetoric and composition at your college. The last thing is relevant to today's discussion because I left academia to pursue, well, civil discourse. Now, you may think the field of rhetorical studies would be doing civil discourse. These are experts in communication, after all. I noticed, however, that that was not happening. The academy became a little too politicized. It became a little too intolerant. And it became more and more full of people, scholars, who refused to talk to anybody who had an opposing opinion. They'd rather cancel or shout down. So you're hearing me correctly. We have experts in communication who refuse to communicate. So, because that's the case in academia, I figured, and Cato agreed, that we create an alternative space for civil rhetoric, civil discourse. And that's what this is about today. And I can't think of a better first guest than Jonathan Rauch, author of The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. I love the fact that you call civil discourse mutual persuasion in this book, right? Can you explain that a little bit more? He's from the Brookings Institute, by the way.
Yeah, we're the other guys, the think tank down the street. Well, I'm flattered and honored to be here. I'm a fan of your work. I think rhetoric is important. And I'm a little bit sorry that you didn't find a more hospitable place in academia for the work that you do. Part of what's happened in academia, I fear, is losing touch with the Constitution of Knowledge. Yes. What's that? That's the norms and rules and institutions that we rely on as a society to keep us grounded in reality and settle our disagreements over what's true and what's not. These are rules that have been devised over a period of hundreds of years since the scientific revolution. They're the rules that we rely on in mainstream, that is fact-based journalism, in law, in government, and above all in science and research and academia. And to a very great extent, what they really are norms of rhetoric. They're how do you frame an argument, hypothesis, in ways that other people can receive and test without turning it into a battle of personal wills or insults. That's why you'll never see a scientific paper that begins, "Jane, you ignorant slut." Saturday Night Live joke for those of you of a certain age. It takes a lot of work to put arguments in these forms that we can then use to test, and we test them by persuading each other. I have to persuade you that this experiment will work when you try it, that this reality, that this hypothesis is backed by facts. You have to do the same for me, and it's in that big process of public exchange that we work out what's true.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that this is hundreds of years old, right? There's a history to this. There's a reason why we do this. The main reason is that we'd rather not shoot each other. Right, yes.
The traditional way of settling disagreements of fact was you would throw the person you disagree with in jail, or they would do that to you, or you'd throw them out of the village, or ostracize them, or very often you just burn them at the stake.
Yeah, so I prefer civil discourse.
Yes.
To all those things. And I'm also wondering, if we are going to kind of make civil discourse cool again, then how do we go about doing that? Besides having shows like this, academia doesn't seem to be cooperating. So what can we do to enhance people's embrace or even knowledge and understanding of civil discourse?
Well, I'm allowed to say, read my book.
Yes, you are allowed to say that.
That's one thing that we could do.
It is a treatise on rhetoric, as far as I'm concerned.
It is, yes. Yeah. I didn't use the term rhetoric in the book because I didn't know your work when I wrote it, but I will use it today because science is a carefully refined form of rhetoric that we use to organize our public discussions about what's true. So there are tons of things that can be done, starting within academia itself. You may disagree, Eric, I'd be curious, but I still think there are deep reservoirs of integrity in academia. They're often buried under layers of DEI administrators and progressive bureaucrats and sometimes some academics who are not on the level. But there's still lots of people there who want to do good, solid research and follow the evidence where it leads. And I think it's important to organize those people, to give those people voice. I've just joined the board of a group called Heterodox Academy.
That's very good. Which
is a group that is trying to ensure viewpoint diversity in universities and doing that through the professoriate, not against them.
Yeah.
I also think I'm also involved with a group called Braver Angels. And that's very much a national grassroots group that's about rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
It's about, can we relearn how to talk across our disagreements? Not so that we'll find common ground, but so that we can relearn the art of communicating. And all of these things are about rhetoric.
Yes.
Those are two of the things that we can do. The third, and maybe the most important, is to teaching. We took the norms of scientific rhetoric, for example, for granted for so long. We just assumed it worked and that it wouldn't be challenged. So that a lot of us were taken by surprise. Postmodernism and deconstructionism and critical theory and queer theory and lots of other things welled up and said, you know, all of these norms that you guys have, what you call science, this is heteronormative, it is white supremacist, it is oppressing minorities. That's gotten a lot of traction. And I think people like me need to do a better job of explaining, no, actually, this is our most universal, most freeing, most minority-friendly form of conversation, because it's the only conversation that allows you to participate no matter who you happen to be.
Yes, yes. There is a term called positionality that the kids are using these days. And that boils down to the idea that you are not a part of my ethnic group, my racial group, my group of sexual orientation. Therefore, you cannot talk to me, you cannot understand me. A conversation between us would be a waste of time.
Right. It's a way of disqualifying people rather than talking to them. And unfortunately, frankly, that's the core human impulse and has been for thousands of years. The breakthrough of the constitution of knowledge, that's the growth of modern science and journalism and so forth, is that it figured out how to move beyond that by forcing us in conversation with each other. The only way that I can show that my hypothesis is correct is to explain it and the reasoning behind it and provide the evidence for it in a way that can persuade anyone else, no matter where they're located or what tribe they're from or what language they speak. Anyone should be able to test it or come in with an argument against it. That's how we create a global network of knowledge seekers that are looking for each other's errors. A kind of global supermind of literally millions and millions of people, thousands and thousands of institutions connected in the web, constantly checking and rechecking facts. That's the miracle that only the system that you are teaching at your university is capable of doing. But you got to inculcate it, right? It doesn't come naturally to anyone. It never will. It requires years of learning, and that's why universities are there.
Yeah, and that's what I got wrong. The assumption that everybody else agreed, that conversation, deliberation, things like that. Key aspects of a pluralistic and free and liberal democracy were embraced by everybody. And
well, guess what?
Yeah.
Too bad for us. I think that's on us. I think small L liberals, people in the classical liberal tradition, the tradition of John Locke and James Madison and Tocqueville, not capital L progressives. I think people like us got too complacent. I think we rested on our laurels for too long. And we just stopped making the case for what we were doing, while some other people were very aggressively promoting illiberal alternatives, like positionality, critical theory, and so forth.
Yes. And this reminds me of another term that I'm hearing more and more these days, epistemic justice. I don't know if you're aware of this concept, but
there's so many.
There's so many.
It's hard to keep up. Yeah, I've heard it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Then
Explain it, though.
You know though that basically what it means is that my mode of knowing is as good as anybody else's mode of knowing. So the scientific method and reading tarot are equal. You know, in trying to.
Yes. I'm just back from New Zealand, where there's a very, very hot controversy over whether schools should teach Maori forms of knowledge. That is, teach these tribal mythologies as an alternative scientific fact in science classes.
That's what I'm talking about. Yes.
Yeah.
So I mean, what do we do with that? You know.
Well, this is to recycle what I just said, part of this is on us because we forgot to make our case. But saying that we have two realities, depending on your viewpoint, is against the rules of the Constitution of Knowledge. Because those are the rules we had for the first 200,000 years of human history. And it turns out that instead of advancing knowledge, they advance conflict. You get people who split into tribes. They simply stand on their viewpoint. They say, I won't communicate with the other tribe. They either schism, divide as societies, or they go into out-and-out conflict. They go into war. This is what led to the 150 years of warfare in the 16th and 17th centuries across Europe. Some of the bloodiest wars ever between Protestants and Catholics, between Protestants and Protestants. This is what the scientific revolution was born out of. People saying, guys, insisting that only people like me can talk to other people like me and not people like you. And by the way, we're right and you're wrong. That's led to nothing but bloodshed and violence. Let's try something different. Let's try the rules being, it doesn't matter who you are. It matters what you say and can you support it.
Yes. And you talk about that in the book in the context of two special rules you have, the empirical and the fallibilist, correct?
Correct.
Can you explain those two?
Yeah, so the reality-based community, this is the community of people. This is academics, researchers, scientists, journalists, lawyers, all the government officials at all the fact-finding agencies. All of those people follow a lot of very intricate rules and norms, everything from sourcing in journalism to footnoting. But the two big revolutionary rules that stand at the heart of the scientific revolution and the Constitution of Knowledge, they are the two you mentioned. First is the fallibilist rule. This says anyone, no matter how certain they are, no matter how high and mighty and exalted they are, no matter how inspired they feel by God, anyone could be wrong about anything at any time. That is a whole new starting point for human knowledge because it begins from the ubiquity of error, and it deprives anyone of the authoritarian ability to say, I'm in charge, you're all wrong, I'm right. Okay. That's revolution number one. Revolution two is the empirical rule. This is associated strongly with John Locke, father of liberalism. And that says, you can be as certain as you want. It doesn't matter. You have to provide evidence and arguments that demonstrate the truth of what you're saying, and not just to you or people like you. What you demonstrate has to work. It has to be persuasive to anyone who looks at it. So if the chemical experiment works in my lab, it needs to work in your lab. If the math works here, it needs to work there. If the argument, logic holds up here, it needs to hold up there. The empirical world is what forces us to compare notes. So suddenly you're in a world where no one is in a position to dominate reality, to dictate reality. And everyone is forced to turn to all the others around them, ultimately in the whole world, to compare notes and persuade each other. That's where you get science. And that's why the first 200,000 years of human history, you get very little advancement in knowledge. Every day, probably before breakfast, humanity advances objective knowledge more than it did in the first 200,000 years. It decoded the coronavirus genome in a weekend. It built a vaccine in a weekend. It did this with thousands of researchers in dozens of institutions. That's the system that those two will set.
When you talk like that, I think, wow, this is how we come up with truth, knowledge, the closest thing to objectivity we can possibly get. I always thought that deliberation was the humanistic counterpart to replication in science. You know, you create something that other people can repeat. You deliberate so that other people can scrutinize, right? This scrutiny is now being called a form of violence. I think the lack of shared values when it comes to a lot of people, whether you're progressive, moderate, conservative, these different emphases of values get in the way. You know, they bump heads. You look at the world, and I have a value of purity, so I enjoy the aesthetic qualities of it. Somebody else might have values of authoritarianism, you know, so they see how this can be manipulated by them or somebody in power or something like that. Would simply understanding that we have different values as groups and that those values are shared by us but emphasized differently, could that do anything to kind of grease the wheels of civil discourse?
Oh, yeah, sure. But more than understanding it, we've got to emphasize it and hammer away at it. So here's what a lot of people have lost sight of, and what I think a lot of people like me forgot to explain. There is a fundamental tenet of human nature, which is different viewpoints, diversity of opinion, often ferocious differences of opinion. Think about something like abortion or gay rights. That's just reality. And the core problem we face epistemically in any society is, how do you manage diversity of viewpoint? How do you manage conflict of opinion? It turns out that all systems but one tend to manage those conflicts by suppressing them. The rule of the strong, the rule of the viewpoint that controls, you know, the office of DEI at a university, whatever it happens to be. There is one system and one system only that harnesses viewpoint diversity by pitting bias against bias. It says, I can never see my biases, you can never see yours, but you can see some of mine, I can see some of yours. And by pitting those against each other, forcing us to compare our biases, that's how we advance knowledge, which means there is only one system that harnesses instead of suppresses actual diversity. You've got to have viewpoint diversity in order to learn. A room full of people that all share the basic assumptions will all be wrong about something and have no way to spot it. And what we need to be evangelizing more about is, if you care about real diversity, and if you care about moral progress, and if you care about learning, you've got to preserve diversity. You've got to have a system that allows diversity to shine forth and prosper. And only one system does that.
And what system is that?
That is the system that I call the Constitution of Knowledge. I've called it liberal science. I've called it the reality-based community. But it's the basic regime that we rely on today in order to compare notes and come to an understanding of what's true.
You say compare notes. That reminds me of the necessity of kind of a single kind of discourse within, say, science or something like that. We all have to be on the same page with some common knowledge that we can assume the other person knows, or else we have to explain everything. We speak in syllogisms all day long, and nobody will ever get a word in edgewise. However, those commonalities are under fire now. You talked about the reality-based society or viewpoint. We can't agree on that. We can't agree on facts. We can't agree on definitions of words that I thought had the same definition for 100 years. We can't agree on the quality or the urgency of a problem. So is this also something that can simply be solved through deliberation and the scrutiny of others? Or is there something else going on there?
Well, there's two ways to talk about that. One is the general theoretical answer, which is super important, and the other is the particular right now answer. The general answer is another version of what I just said, which is the truth is humans have never agreed on facts. We perceive the world differently. We disagree on what's true and what's false. There's only one system that harnesses that disagreement, forces us to compare notes and persuade each other. That system relies on disagreements about facts. But it does require some basic agreement on the process that we will go through to determine what's true and what's false. And that's why, for example, in the astronomy department at your former university, they did not teach astrology. Some people believe it. In fact, last check, 25% of Americans believed it. Why don't we teach it? Because it hasn't passed any of the tests that follow the rules that we rely on to bring us toward knowledge. So that's the broad theoretical answer. The constitution of knowledge is the answer to this question. That's specifically what it addresses, turning the heat of conflict into the light of knowledge. The right now answer to that question, here we get into a little bit of politics. So fasten your seatbelt. Thanks to the innovations of social media, which are unfiltered and immediate and very subject to manipulation by bots, algorithms, and trolls, and thanks to the MAGA movement's discovery and repurposing of Russian-style mass disinformation, and that involves putting out lies, exaggerations, conspiracy theories, and half-truths out on such a scale and at such a rate that fact-checkers can't possibly keep up. So everyone's talking about do Haitians eat cats and dogs? Yeah. That these things together have combined in an explosive combination to turbocharge misinformation and disinformation in a way that America has not seen in probably 100 years. We have been through versions of this before. Yes. I realize that there are people probably around here at Cato who don't like the terms misinformation and disinformation, but they are real things. Especially disinformation is a series of techniques that can be used to confuse, deceive, disorient, divide, and ultimately dominate people. And we're seeing a big upswelling of that.
Flooding the swamp, so they say, with the material I won't mention.
I think we should go there. It's a famous quote by Steve Bannon, who is an advisor to Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. But it also happens to be a very technically accurate description of Russian-style mass disinformation. He called it flooding the zone with shit. The system we're talking about, constitution of knowledge, it requires good faith effort by most people most of the time to try to say what's true. Right. And to try to go about the exercise of comparing my view and your view in good faith. Now, some people won't. They'll be trolling. They'll be playing games. Right. They'll be doing other forms of rhetoric. But at the core of politics and law, you want people who have some respect for the norms of truth. Well, it turns out those norms are a lot more vulnerable than we realized 10 years ago.
Yes, yes. I think, we can't drop the ball this time when it comes to social media. The disinhibition effect. There's a psychologist named Jonathan Rauch who wrote a book on this. And the disinhibited behavior of people online is vastly different from how they be in person. If you must have a conversation on social media, you would do well to understand how to discern misinformation and disinformation from information, to triangulate or something like that. I think it's up to us as people who respect rhetoric and emphasize it in their lives to give people those skills. Right?
Absolutely. And in fact, to go back to your specialty in life, so tell me if you think this is right, but it takes a lot of work to structure discourse. If you just put people in a room and tell them to have at it, you're going to get chaos and a lot of loud arguments, and you're not going to get very far. So you need to give people forms of rhetoric that they become accustomed to using. And in everyday conversation, we call that courtesy, civility, politeness, right. Things you do and don't say. I'm just not going to say to you, Eric, my God, that is an ugly jacket. I'm not going to speak of, it's not, by the way, but I'm not going to speak to you disrespectfully. But it takes years to train kids to be like that. Okay, so now you go over to professional truth finders, people in science and journalism and so forth. It takes years to learn the rhetorical forms of what you do and don't say in a newspaper article, how you're going to structure your scientific research, what you're going to say at an academic conference, and what you're not going to say. Do we have rhetorical norms and forms for social media? I would guess you would say the answer is we don't. And if that's the answer, how do we get them?
Yes. So we should look at social media as a kind of genre of writing. A lot of different forms of academic essays are out there because you're doing different things, right? The standard academic essay, you have your thesis statement, supporting ideas, counter argument, and things like that. And op-ed has that too, but in a smaller scale. Then you have epistolary writings, which are vastly different. So it's about the format as well as the content. So if we can structure this in a certain way, we can figure out what that structure is. That can go a long way in helping people communicate on social media. Would that be accurate?
Well, I would hope so. The question is, this is a question for an expert on rhetoric, can you teach people, socialize people into social media in a way that we were able to socialize them into other forms of rhetoric?
Right. It's worth a shot. That I can say, in my professional opinion. It's definitely worth a shot, and I think the proper structuring can also go a long way. But social media and face-to-face interaction are vastly different, and that difference is something that may not be overcome. So we do have to look at social media as a lesser form of communication. Yes, it's here if we want to talk, but this is always the best way to go about it. I can see your body language, I can see your eyes, I can discern other things about you that tell me what kind of discourse you prefer.
Right, yes, you're getting real-time feedback from me, and you're adjusting your discourse as we go. And online, you may well be anonymous, so there's no accountability. I don't really know who you are. I don't even know if you're human online, right? At one point, there were estimates that 50% of the voices on Twitter, as it then was, were in fact bots.
Yes.
Not even human. So how you develop norms in that environment, I'm not really sure. I've kind of hoped that over time, that one of the things human societies are pretty good at is figuring out ways to get along if we have to. We'll try everything else first. We'll try war and domination and schism. But these rules we've been talking about, the Constitution of Knowledge, like the U.S. Constitution, didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of years of struggle and conflict. And it came out of people saying, okay, there must be a better way. How can we structure rules that will actually work? And I guess what needs to happen in social media world, and now in the political age that we've entered, which has been so affected by social media, the question becomes, can we do that again? Can we develop, can we generate rules and norms to teach ourselves to be our better selves in these environments?
Well, I think that's a great place to end. Jonathan,
you're not going to give me the answer?
No. In fact, if you have the answer, you can go ahead and tweet it out or tweet it to me at Rhetoric of York. And do you want to share your information?
I have a website, jonathanrauch.com.
Oh, there you go. And I have a website inspired by Jonathan Rauch called mutualpersuasion.org that explains the fundamentals of rhetoric and civil discourse. Please take a look at that if you want to learn some more about what we're doing here. Thank you for attending this event. There will be more to come, and I hope you join us for that too.